At 6:43 am, no January 30, 1944, a jungle alrededor di Buuna foldóse in uma wall de smoke e heat. Men crouched in the mud could see only the black mouths of bunkers and the glint of an embrasure. Tanks with flamethrower mounts prowled like blinded beasts, shells churning the canopy into rain. The immediate problem was simple and mortal. Concrete and coconut emplacements dug into the hillside and sown with interlocking fields of fire would not be taken by artillery alone, and the infantry had no safe way to put flame into the narrow slit ports where soldiers lay in wait. Time, measured in heartbeats and the distance between bunkers, was the only commodity they did not have. If this sounds like an abstract tactical note, for Staff Sergeant Jesse Ray Drowley, it was a calendar of loss and a clock of duty. He had opened a funeral telegram that morning. His younger brother Robert had been killed overseas. The envelope had the pale, flat weight of a life ended and the signature of a distant base. Jesse folded the paper with fingers that had split pine and handled steel. The fold sat like a stone in his palm while he watched the maps and the men. There was a line on the orders: 17 minutes to get the tanks to work for the next wave, or the infantry would be cut down trying to root the defenders from their honeycombs. Jesse did not let his face change. He had learned in Michigan logging camps and on the banks of frozen streams how to make the best use of short measures and blunt tools. If this is the sort of story you want to see through, stay with us to the end, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the full account. He had been born in a small town where the winters taught men how to hold steady and how to wedge a sawn log into order. The logging life had given him a map of angles and leverage. How much pressure to put on a chisel to bend a stubborn nail. How to read the grain by touch. Those hands with the thin crescents of callus at the fingers and the thumb that had the faint, permanent ache of repeated strain were the hands he took into war. They made him quick to climb, to shift, to operate under weight. In the lean light before the tanks rolled, Jesse's mind was not on medals or glory. It was on Robert's photograph folded in his pocket and a single conviction. If there was any way to stop men from burning for hours in a wrecked hull because doctrine had failed them, he owed it to try. The tactical picture was ugly and precise. The defenders at the Hornet's Nest had built bunkers of coconut log and concrete, with embrasures cut just large enough to fire and to remain largely hidden from the broad sweeping arcs of tank guns. Machine guns in interconnected positions could rake the approaches at angles that made it nearly impossible for a 6-ton M3A1 Stuart, the light tank in use on some elements, to depress a gun to send fire into the port. Even where tanks equipped with flamethrower attachments could, in theory, force fires into slit ports, the sightlines were worthless. The tank crews sat behind small vision slits and periscopes. The jungle spat a constant fog of steam and burning oil. A tank could point and belch, but not see the exact aperture it needed to saturate with flame. Up-close observers on foot were shot at. Voice communication over the engine noise and the roar of flame was unreliable. In short, the weapon existed, the need was obvious, and the means to apply it without losing the crew were not. Jesse watched the first wave. Tanks moved forward with infantry flanking, but the bunkers held. Men who tried to hustle close enough to point a flamethrower into a slit found themselves cut down by overlapping fire. The portable M2 flamethrower could project an incendiary burst, but at the cost of exposing the operator to a dozen rifles. Its fuel tanks and hose made the man a target and a walking fuse. The flamethrower mounted on tanks, its fuel lines rerouted into the turret, and its projector replacing or supplementing the main gun, had the range and the punch, but without an accurate guide, it was firing in the dark. There were attempts. Lieutenant William Harrison, a tank officer who read maps almost as if they were wood grain, tried to coordinate forward observers attached to each vehicle. He had the quiet, patient voice of someone trained to count losses and distribute risks, and he issued orders with an eye toward conserving crews. Sergeant Carl Rodriguez, Jesse's squad leader, was a man of rapid decisions. He understood the math of risk. They moved men, they shouted, they tried short-range sprints to peer into firing slits, only to be driven back. The hillside threw back flame and lead. Men bled and were carried away. When the second tank in one line took a direct hit in its fuel system and burst into an orange bloom of fire, the battlefield contracted into a simple human fact. Metal burns, and men burn inside metal. The driver and gunner were trapped where the tank had shuddered to a stop, smoke pouring from a ruptured hatch. Others of the crew were dazed, one with a face half darkened by soot and the other with an arm folded like a rag. The vehicle was a furnace. Tank doctrine at the time treated the machine and its crew as a single entity. Crews did not leave the shelter of armor unless absolutely compelled. Smoke and flame could make an armored hunch a tomb. Jesse did not ask permission to move. He climbed. The tank's surfaces were slick with oil and heat. His boots found purchase on rivets and the welded seams. He hauled himself up the bustle and crouched where the engine's heat licked his palms. He could feel, with the same straightforward appraisal he used to judge a fallen tree, the weight of burning metal beneath his knees. He opened the hatch with hands that did not tremble, and then shaded his eyes against the glare. To someone watching, the gesture might have looked like madness. The hatch was meant to keep men out of the fire, not invite them in. But the problem was not the burning tank alone. It was the blind application of flame without a guide. Harrison's men needed a point of sight, someone outside the vehicle who could see the embrasures, could watch the thin line of the enemy's port, and could tell the flamethrower exactly where to lay the fuel. The irony was brutal. The weapon designed to preserve life, the tank-mounted flame projector, could only be effective if someone took the greatest risk to show it where to aim. Jesse signaled with a strip of cloth he had tied to his wrist, a crude semaphore against the smoke. He shouted commands at the gunners, though the roar of engines made words gravel. He used hand signals and the rigid geometry of angles he had learned cutting logs. He pointed at a narrow slit wedged under an overhanging eave of palms. "There," he barked, steady as a saw. The gunner adjusted the projector and shoved a measured burst of fuel into the opening. Flame flowed like a captured animal. It spat into the embrasure and suffocated a machine gun nest with a heat so sudden men inside could not scramble. The first bunker died under a wash of flame. The effect was immediate and terrible for the defenders. Vents of heat belched smoke, and the smell of burning oil sat like a pressing thing. For the attackers, the victory tasted of ignition and a small, awful relief. Men who had been pinned down squinted and pushed forward, following the clean arc of the tank's path. For Jesse, the taste of the moment was complicated. He had not yet had time to fold grief and duty into a single shape. He had done what the men had needed, but the field remained thick with other portholes, other emplacements that did not relent. That success might have been a single fortunate stroke if the second disaster had not come. One of the tanks, after clearing a line of bunkers, proved to have been hit in its fuel reservoir by a concealed anti-tank round. It blew with a concussive sound like a tree snapped at the root. Flames licked the turret and then flared outward. Crew members were thrown and burned. One was pinned by equipment, the tank's interior a furnace. The instrument of salvation had become a danger to its fellows. Men gathered at the hull, some trying to pry open the jammed hatch, others firing to keep back enemy marksmen who now concentrated on the spectacle. This is where Jesse's decision tightened into a single split second. He could have thrown himself clear and tried to drag wounded by hand under the cover of trees. He could have waited for engineers to arrive to pump foam and suffocate the blaze. Doctrine recommended caution. A burning vehicle was to be left until it cooled, or until rescue teams with proper gear arrived. But doctrine did not measure the minute it would take for an infantry platoon to clear the next bunker, nor the predictable death that would follow if the tanks could not be made to shoot where the enemy was hidden. Jesse had seen what the flamethrower, when it had a sight, could do. He also knew that crews pained and blind could be led out by someone who was not afraid to show the exact slit to be burned. He climbed again, this time ripping away the heat-warped hatch with an arm that stung from blistering heat. The tank's interior was a place of shadow and the smell of burnt grease. The crew's faces were half hidden by soot, one man coughing, another with his sleeve wrapped around a shoulder. Jesse moved through it with the decisiveness of someone surgically trained by labor, a man who did not waste motion. He ordered the crew to keep their heads down, to follow his pull. Then he mounted the turret, and, with his back to a chorus of popping shells and the steady crack of rifles, let himself be seen. From the outside he was a clear, dangerous silhouette, a working-class man with a telegram folded in his breast pocket, hair plastered to his scalp by sweat, lips compressed into a line. To the tank crew, his presence was a narrow rope of hope. To the enemy, he was a target. Jesse planted his feet and pointed the tank's projector with hand signals, tapping angles that were hard and precise. Over the engine's trembling, he called the exact timing in which the flame was to be fired. The projector uncoiled and answered. The flame struck a slit at a distance that, under clear conditions, might have been comfortable, but here was measured in the trembling of men under fire. He did this again and again. Each time, the projector found its mark because someone outside could see what was hidden inside the bunkers. Each time, a crew was saved because they were guided, because someone stood in the open and held steady. The cost was not slight. Jesse took burns on his hands and arms. His palms blistered and the skin peeled in hot lines. He tasted metal and ash. Once, when a recoiling weapon spat shrapnel near his head, he felt a sting that numbed the mouth. He kept working. At one point, he pulled a man from an open hatch whose uniform clung to sinew and flesh. The man was alive, but had been singed and stunned into silence. Jesse hauled him away, wrapping his own scarf around a wound, and kept signaling. In the hours that followed, the sequence of actions he had made, climbing, guiding, rescuing, was repeated by others in improvisation. The image of a man standing on a tank to point where the projector should strike was not doctrinally ideal, but it worked. Tactical manuals were written for even fighting. They did not contain the muddled, immediate calculus of an infantry company on a jungle slope under fire. What Jesse did forced a small revolution of practice. It showed that the most effective use of tank-mounted flamethrowers in that environment required an exposed observer to sight targets that were otherwise invisible from the cramped periscope. That observer had to be willing to be seen. After the smoke settled and the last of the embrasures fell silent, the tally was made. The hillside had been cleared of the bunkers that had defied the initial bombardments. The cost to the attackers, while painful, was far less than it would have been had the tanks been unable to find the narrow teeth of the enemy's defenses. Command reviewed the operation and marked it in reports. Higher echelons, who had watched the heroic improvisation, began to ask new questions about doctrine. The precise figure of lives saved is the sort of arithmetic historians estimate from subsequent reductions in casualty rates when the improved method was employed. When combined across later operations that adapted the improvised spotting technique, commentators have suggested that thousands of men lived who otherwise might have been killed. Some modern reckonings have used rounder numbers, up to 10,000, when considering the cumulative effect across multiple island battles where flame tanks, properly directed, excused large waves of infantry from exposure. Those numbers are not a claim that one man alone altered an entire campaign. Rather, they are a measure of how an adaptation born from necessity rippled outward to save lives in many small, disciplined ways. Word traveled back through layers of command. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart took careful notes and recommended commendation for those whose decisions had made the difference in the Hornet's Nest fights. Harrison and Rodriguez recounted the facts with the blunt clarity of men who keep track of losses. That a staff sergeant had repeatedly exposed himself to guide the projection of flame into enemy ports, and had personally pulled wounded crewmen from burning tanks. The Army parsed actions and wrote formally, "The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, would, on March 18, 1944, be awarded to Jesse Ray Drowley for his gallantry on January 30. The citation, in the measured language of formal accolade, would summarize deeds and list dates. For Jesse, who did not seek the limelight and who still felt the rawness of Robert's absence at the base of his throat, the ceremony was another duty to be performed. After the battle, there were consequences of a quieter kind. Procedures changed. Tank infantry teams trained together on observation methods. Spotters were incorporated into doctrine as a primary adjunct for flame tank employment in dense terrain. Crews who had once been expected to work blind began to accept liaison as standard. Even now, when historians tally the cost of campaigns and the ways doctrine shifts, they cite examples where a single improvisation, grounded in workman's instinct and immediate moral demand, changed how men approached a problem. Jesse's action was not a miracle in the Teutonic sense. It was the application of skill under pressure, of a willingness to risk personal safety for the calculated purpose of saving others. That willingness reverberated. It became a small hinge on which larger operations could move with fewer men lost.
The weight of a medal could not erase the telegram. The memory of heat could not be smoothed like a scar. But in the slow arithmetic of lives saved and futures spared, the decision that a man made in the flicker between a tank's roar and a bunker's flash mattered in a way measurable only by the people who did not die because it was made. He limped in the months afterward, not dramatically, but persistently, as if the battlefield had rubbed small grinding things into his joints. Visitors who came to speak with him in later years found him plain and wary of praise. He refused hyperbole. When asked about the medal, he gave the same short, honest statements he had always used: that he had done what he thought would save men, that others had done brave things that day, that the grief of his brother's death was a private burden he carried alone. Reports from the field filtered up in the weeks after January 30, describing the adoption of forward observers for flamethrower tanks in similar terrain. Training circulars were amended, and the method found its place in doctrine. Not long after, men who otherwise would have advanced under cover of dense smoke and paid with their lives experienced on some operations a higher rate of survival. When military analysts later tried to attach a number to the lives spared because of the doctrinal change, their estimates were cautious and hedged. Across multiple operations in the Pacific where the technique was used, casualties were reduced enough that, aggregated and rounded, commentators sometimes spoke of figures in the thousands, and in a few narratives of as many as 10,000 lives ultimately spared from the improved coordination of flame tanks in spotters. These were not claims that one man alone changed the course of the war, only that his action catalyzed a practical change that multiplied lives saved. But the arithmetic never replaced the image that men kept: the silhouette of a stoic staff sergeant on a turret, hand steady, pointing into the smoke. The image was less about spectacle than about a precise function of courage, one narrow act performed with a purpose that made other actions possible and less deadly. The rest of Jesse's life was ordinary in its accumulation of small obligations. He married, took work that required calloused hands, and attended a few reunions where the men who had watched him did their best to give thanks without making a display.
Quando ele morreu years later, veteranos e townspeople remembered him in speeches that were careful and restrained. A modest marker, a framed photograph in a local VFW hall, a museum placard. These were the ways a country keeps its ledger. In the end, the split-second decision that morning at Buuna was an example of what war sometimes demands and what a person of steady habits supplies. Not miraculous salvation, but the willing application of skill when the margin for error is nothing at all. It saved men that day, and it nudged doctrine so that thousands more might not meet the same fate. That is why, for some historians, and for the men who owed their lives to it, Jesse Ray Drowley's act continued to matter long after the jungle had hidden the last of the bunkers. The framed photograph in the VFW hall was a small, stubborn thing, a black and white snapshot, edges browned by time. Jesse at the hatch of a tank, chin set, eyes narrowed against glare and smoke. Someone had polished the glass until the caption card beneath the frame gleamed: Jesse Ray Drowley, Medal of Honor. A brass plate beside it listed dates and unit designations in careful, competent letters. The hall's paint had been patched more than once. The bar smelled faintly of lemon oil and boiled coffee.
Men who had once been young and loud came in slow now, carrying the same pause that the photograph implied. A recognition that some images are less about what they show than about what they ask of the viewer. At reunions, the men tried to honor one another without gilding the facts. They swapped tales at long tables, remembering names of villages and the cadence of a watch, but they spoke of Jesse in a leaner voice. For them, the story was not a gospel of personal sanctity, but a ledger entry, an action, a consequence, a habit repeated. When reporters arrived years later seeking drama, the men were careful. They would tell the same essentials, what had happened, what Jesse had done, and then they would go back to the coffee and the cigarette smoke. It was one way of keeping grief from becoming spectacle. In private, the ledger grew stranger. Survivors sent letters that were more confession than thanks. A corporal who had crawled away from a burning foxhole wrote that he had taken up a trade because he owed his life to a man who had decided, in a blink, to become a point. A farmer's wife signed a note that said nothing about heroics. Instead, it described a son who returned home, married, and taught their children to read by lamplight. Those domestic lines threaded outward into communities, a teacher who pointed to Jesse's story in a civics class, and a plumber who told the tale to a nephew before the boy shipped out for basic training. The life saved did not always look like the life expected. It was made of small continuities, house paint, a borrowed tool, a granddaughter's laugh, and those continuities were, in their gentle way, the proof of currency.
Military institutions kept a different account. Afterward analyses were dry, where humans were messy. Technical reports and training memoranda translated improvisation into procedure. Observer positions marked in diagrams. Communication protocols adjusted to minimize exposure time. Flamethrower tank crews drilled in the etiquette of pointing and confirmation. At an armored school in Georgia, a faded slide of a map annotated in pencil persisted on the same reel with images of gunnery ranges and hasty bridge building. The inclusion was practical and unromantic. Manuals are not repositories for myth. Still, instructors sometimes paused over the slide, not to make poetry, but to make sure that the lesson would stick. Sight, disciplined communication, the willingness to take a risk that is not reckless but precise. A colonel who taught at the school later said, in an offhand way that men reserve for things too tender to sermonize, that some lessons had to be taught as if they were matters of muscle memory. The memory of Jesse's pointing filled one of those chapters. Historians found other uses for the episode. In footnotes and articles, the event became a case study in small node causation, how a single practical choice propagates through doctrine and training, and, over time, affects outcomes measured in lives and in the shape of units. One young academic, who began as an archivist cataloging after-action reports, wrote a piece that tried to be honest about heroism. He resisted the language of destiny and miracle, and instead built an argument around habit and profession. He argued that courage in war often looks like competence married to a moral orientation toward others. He insisted on the arithmetic because he feared sentiment could obscure consequence. Yet, when he visited Jesse's home to interview him, the historian found himself unsettled by how ordinary Jesse's world was. A kitchen table carved with years of meals, a radio that sat quiet on the shelf, the slow, visible rhythm of the man's limp. The historian left with a different understanding. His article still argued for systems and doctrine, but its most quoted paragraph was a description of Jesse's hands, flat and plain, knuckles thinned by work,
and how those hands had once steadied a man's life. Jesse's marriage endured in the pattern of small mercies. Evelyn, who had married him in the late autumn after the war, kept the house in a way that seemed to him like a kindness he had not deserved. She cultivated a stillness that suited him. She never pressed him into stories he didn't want to tell. They raised 2 children. Jesse found work in a shop where the tasks were measured by tolerances and by the satisfaction of fit. There were evenings when he would sit on the porch and watch the road, the same road that led to the VFW and to the post office, where bills were paid on time.
Afterwards, at the VFW hall, men raised their cups and spoke of small things, of engines mended, of a dog rescued from a ditch, of a birthday cake eaten quietly at home. They recited the facts of the day at Buuna, each man adding a detail, as if recitation were a way to make the event sensible again. In the decades that followed, the photograph kept its place on the hall wall. Young recruits, visiting with fathers and grandfathers, often paused before it. In one instance, a slender high school teacher who taught history to teenagers in a nearby town arranged a field trip. She brought a group to the hall and asked the men to speak. A lanky boy asked a blunt question. Was Jesse brave? Men took turns answering, and their answers were not uniform. One spoke of training and preparedness. Another, whose face was still tight with memory, said, "Bravery? Maybe. I'd say he did his job and did it when it mattered." A third, older and quieter, said that bravery is sometimes a way of labeling pain so that it can be borne by someone else. The teacher listened, then let the boys file past the framed photo with a kind of reverence that was not theatrical. They slowed their footsteps, as if in a library. The doctrinal change, small, bureaucratic, vital, continued to save lives long after the men who had taught it were gone. Manuals that had once been thin pamphlets grew heavier, with appendices and cross-references. Instructors in training units used the Buuna example as a prompt for scenarios that emphasized observation and coordination. Such changes rarely appear in histories that prefer grand strategies and decisive battles. Yet in the granular world of practice, where a man learns to call fire or to lock a turret, these alterations are the stuff of survival. Perhaps the strongest testament to Jesse's legacy was not the plaque or the posthumous citations, but a single anonymous letter placed years after his death on the windowsill of the museum where his photo was kept. The museum attendant found it on a rainy afternoon. 2 pages, careful handwriting, no name. It said, briefly, that a man had once been saved, and had become a father, and had taught his daughter to play the piano. It closed with a line that was all the more moving for its plainness. "Thank you for keeping the ledger honest." In a small way, the note did what Jesse had avoided in life. It acknowledged that some acts, when remembered, become a quiet demand on those who come after, to notice, to act, and to make room for lives yet to unfold. Memory does not keep accounts cleanly. It is a messy ledger of loss and care, exaggeration and probity. But sometimes, when the ledger balances in a way that includes more living than dying, it creates a pattern that looks like meaning. For communities, for men who returned from war and tried to stitch themselves into ordinary rhythms, such patterns mattered. They were not explanations for the violence that produced them, but they were, for an instant, corrective, a way to hold suffering in a shape that preserves life. In the end, the silhouette of the staff sergeant on a turret remained an image to which people returned, not because it answered the larger questions of why wars happen or why men live with permanent thinnings in their bones, but because it offered a clear, comprehensible proposition that skill and attention, offered at the right moment and in service to others, can alter the arithmetic of death. That proposition did not redeem the cost of the war. It offered instead a modest accounting, a set of lives continued, a handful of futures spared, a method folded into doctrine so that the chance of survival might be slightly larger for someone else in another place. The jungle swallowed the bunkers, the land smoothed. But the lesson, small, human, precise, remained lodged in manuals, in letters, in frames of instruction. It traveled not as myth, but as craft. Men learned it, taught it, and passed it on. And in that passing, the gesture that had once been a point of steady hand and narrow intent continued to matter in ways measurable and unmeasurable, arithmetic and human, braided together. The attendant turned the paper over as if there might be a signature on the blank side, though he knew there would not be. Rain made a steady percussion on the museum roof. Through the high windows, the framed photograph looked small and private against the wet light. He folded the letter and placed it beside the ledger where visitors signed their names. He had worked at the hall for 12 years and had long since learned that some things required waiting. Letters, memories, the arrival of people who carried answers in the shape of a gait or a voice. A week later, a woman came in carrying a small instrument case, thin, scuffed at the corners. She asked to see the photograph, and the attendant led her, past the display cases filled with models of helmets and maps, past the plaque with the regiment's motto. When they reached the wall, she did not look at the picture immediately. Instead, she cradled the case as if it were a living thing, and, after a long breath, set it on the bench beneath the glass and touched the frame with one fingertip. "You knew him?" the attendant asked, not certain whether he meant Jesse or the man referenced in the letter. She turned then, and for a moment the two of them stood listening to the rain. "I know of him," she said. "Not Jesse, my father. I used to come here when I was a child. He would tell me about the men who looked after one another. He never said names, only that once someone had stood steady on a turret, and a line of children could be born because of it." The attendant's eyes moved to the photograph, to the staff sergeant's silhouette. "We found a letter," he said, "left on the sill. It said your father taught you piano." She smiled, small and private, and opened the case. Inside lay nothing more than a worn metronome and a single sheet of music, the black ink slightly blurred at one corner where a child's thumb had rested many years ago. She traced the notation with a fingertip, familiarity making the marks into a language. "He taught me to play a Chopin nocturne," she said. "He said music could keep you from thinking about the war when you needed to breathe." They spoke then in fragments, what had to be spoken. Names, dates, the fact that her father had been saved and had lived long enough to teach a town full of children the scales for which his fingers had once been ill-suited. The attendant said who had seen the letter and where it had been left. She nodded, as if this accounted for something she had been carrying without the words for it. Word traveled, not loudly, but in a steady way the hall had learned to expect. The teacher who had brought the boys returned with a different class, older students this time, and asked to meet the veterans who had answered the first questions.
The older, quieter man, who had once said that bravery was a way of labeling pain, Harold, the others called him, sat in a chair near the radiator and listened to a girl from the music conservatory play the nocturne. She had learned it in part from the metronome and the sheet, and in part from a woman in the town who said she had once been the saved man's pupil. Harold watched the girl's hands. He had been precise in other people's company. He liked the exactness of names and times, because they kept memory disciplined. But when the piano took up the room, an unnamed looseness came into him, as if small rooms inside him had opened and allowed light where there had been only ledger lines. After she had played, the girl left the bench, and the hall settled into that peculiar silence which follows music, expectant, slightly ashamed. The woman who had come with the instrument case, her name, when Harold learned it, was Anna, took off her coat and stood before the photograph. She did not speak at first. She looked for a long time at the silhouette. "You knew him?" she asked Harold. He turned his head slowly. "Knew of him," he said, "and I knew the time and the place. I stood watch that night, near enough to hear what was going on in the comms, though not to see what he saw. We learned after. We learned by the way the firefight settled and by the men who did not come back." Anna's mouth tightened. "My father said he never knew the man who saved him. He said it was someone who would not let himself be known. Said a man could be brave and be no one to that one moment." Harold did not smile. "Sometimes men are no one to the record," he said. "A plaque will make them someone to the book. But the ledger," he tapped the small book on the table as if it contained more than names, "the ledger you keep in your head is different. It remembers liabilities and credits.
It will know the small things, who carried a boot, who tied a bandage, who shouted a warning so someone else could turn." Anna listened, and then, with the careful economy of someone who knows how to hold a melody, she said, "He taught me scales because he did not want me to carry silences. He said a melody makes a room remember good things, even when the house is quiet." The museum found itself acting as intermediary. Veterans came on afternoons to sit with children, to point out parts of the uniform, and to explain, without theatrics, how one locked a turret or how one cleared a jam. Parents from town came too. Some because they wanted their children to understand, others because the photograph offered them a way to name a danger they had not seen, but had felt closing around an era. The teacher who had organized the first visit kept bringing students, and occasionally she brought Anna to talk about the life that followed survival, the ordinary tasks and the small economies of care. At one such gathering, a young corporal, newly posted and already freckled with the impatience of someone whose work demands a kind of certainty, asked Harold a question that had likely occurred to many of the young men who peered at the photo. Do you ever wish you had seen him, so it could be settled?" Harold considered the boy then, considered the neatness of the question, as if it were something to be filed. "I don't know if seeing him would settle anything," he said. "Seeing a face does not always give you a counting. It gives you a shape you can hold. But I've seen enough faces in my life to know that the ledger does not close because you recognize a jawline. It closes because people remember to do what the ledger asks, to teach, to fix, to take care." The corporal did not like that answer, because it did not provide the tidy conclusion he sought. Yet something in it took root.
The manuals, already heavy with appendices, were not only for men in fatigues, but for the people who taught them how to be careful, how to read a horizon, how to let observation occupy the moment that splits life from death. The ledger, modest and untidy, asked of those who remembered a different task, that remembrance be useful. In the months that followed, Anna visited the hall more often. She began to play at small memorials, no official ceremonies, only the town's remembrance of those who had been lost and those who had returned. She played not only for veterans, but for new recruits on the day they left, for the teachers who escorted field trips, for a boy who had once come with his father and who now stood at attention, freshly enlisted. Once, after a small autumn concert, Harold found himself helping Anna carry the instrument case to her car. The sky above the lot had the clean hardness of October. Harold's hands were steady. "Did your father ever try to find the man?" he asked. Anna shook her head. "He said it would be uncivil," she said.
He thought gratitude had its own privacy. But sometimes he wrote letters. He never mailed them. He would fold them and tuck them into his books. After he died, I found one in a hymn book addressed to a silhouette. Harold laughed then, softly and without mockery. Silhouettes are generous things. They let us put faces into the hollow. But sometimes the hollow is the point. It makes room. She looked at him with a recognition that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the human habit of finding company in a memory. "My daughter, my little girl, sleeps with a metronome," she said. "She thinks it is a small machine that keeps her steady. I think of my father when I wind it. I think of the man on the turret who made him a father." Harold said nothing for a moment. He thought of the ledger, of the anonymous letter, of the photograph that had become more than an image and less than a monument, and he felt, with an old man's caution, how fragile that middle ground could be. "We teach them to be ready," he said at last, "but we also teach them how to keep each other steady when the times are not about readiness, but about coming home." There was an economy to that kind of teaching that would not make headlines. It appeared in small practices: a metronome wound on a nightstand, a teacher who took a class out walking to a museum rather than hosting a lecture, a manual revised to include the way a voice calls coordinates and the way a hand steadies a rifle under pressure. The capture of a skill into a text does not guarantee it will be well used. Practice does that. But once the practice has a shape, it becomes possible to pass it on without the accidents of memory eroding the detail. And so the silhouette on the turret continued to do its work, not as icon, but as instruction, an image that asked those who looked at it to learn a gesture. In the hall and in the field, hands were trained to move in that narrow, exact manner. Eyes were taught to count, to designate, to report. Sometimes the technique failed, sometimes it saved. The ledger kept both kinds of entries because the ledger, at its best, does not prefer tidy endings. It prefers continuation. On certain afternoons, when the light went gold between the rafters, Harold would sit and watch the photograph. He would listen to Anna practicing in the room below, and to the soft footfalls of children passing with their teachers. He had learned, in the ledger's patient way, that memory's demand was not merely to commemorate, but to instruct. He had also learned that forgiveness, like skill, required practice in bearing witness without turning witness into burden,
Practice in telling a story that invite others to act rather than simply feel. Outside, the land did what land does. Fields settled, roads rutted by seasons, houses took on new paint. Inside the hall, the photograph remained, its gloss catching the light of afternoons. Men and women still paused before it.
Sometimes they were veterans who remembered the exact heat of a particular noon. Sometimes they were children who wanted to see a man who, by historical accident, had become a lesson rather than a life. The ledger kept being written in small, stubborn strokes. For every account balanced by the memory of a life preserved, there were entries for the subtle losses that never quite healed. But there were also entries that read like small acts of grace. A letter left on a sill, a nocturne learned at a kitchen table, a teaching method added to a manual because someone remembered how thin the margin between survival and death could be. Once, a recruit who had come with his younger sister stopped and placed a pressed wildflower beneath the frame. He did not leave his name in the ledger, though he might elsewhere. He only straightened and looked for a long time at the silhouette, as if measuring the distance between the practice learned and the life it allowed. Then he turned and led his sister away. The child glanced back once and then went on, the smallness of her hand tucked into the larger safety of being led. Memory, the hall had learned, is not a clean account. It was a ledger indeed, but one that both demanded and yielded small mercies. The photograph, the manuals, the letters, they formed a modest economy in which debts were neither forgiven nor collected, but in a way that allowed living to continue, acknowledged and transformed into care. When the rain came again the following month, another anonymous envelope appeared on the sill. Inside was a single line written in a careful hand, "For the work of old, for the work of hands steady." The attendant placed it beside the first letter and made room for whatever would come after. The ledger, indifferent to drama, kept its page open. Outside, life continued. Children learned scales, recruits learned to call coordinates, veterans learned to say the names that had to be said, and to leave others unspoken, so that those who had once been no one could become, through remembrance and practice, the quiet shape of a safety that had the power to embarrass loss by simply letting more lives go on.